Finally, just to finish my rough sketch of St. Thomas, when we speak of growth in holiness, we must be careful not to take too seriously the analogy of education, as though we're graduating from one stage to another. Graduating, in the case of the gifts of the Spirit, from the fear of the Lord to wisdom, as though a saint, one who is perfect in wisdom, moves beyond the fear of the Lord, never needs it again. The fear of the Lord is not the beginning of wisdom in a chronological sense, as learning the alphabet would be the beginning of writing. No, all of the virtues and the gifts operate together. The wise person is one who knows not only that he must depend on God to show him what the love of God and neighbor are requiring of him day by day, but he also knows that weaknesses of the flesh will be with him always to the end, always threatening to trip him up. In the fear of the Lord, he can never take for granted that the disorders and weaknesses of the flesh have been perfectly and permanently healed. He would agree with the Irish proverb that you have to be 3 days dead. Now, the way of thinking about holiness was formulated by medieval theologians, drawing on the classical heritage of philosophy and the literature of early monasticism. And Newman was familiar with these sources, but he was not at all familiar with the medieval formulation of them. When he was in Rome, he wanted to have a tutorial in Thomas Aquinas. He knew that he should read him, but to our shame, he could never find anyone in Rome willing to do that. Interestingly, he says that the Dominicans in Rome, who taught St. Thomas, were so busy trying to marshal arguments against the Immaculate Conception at this time that they had no time to teach Newman to read St. Thomas. And he said the Jesuits were not much better. He said they were so engaged in apologetic that they were eclectic in their theology. They didn't strictly adhere to Thomas. So it wasn't a very good theological scene in Rome when he was there, and he was frustrated by that. So Newman never does use scholastic language to speak about the operations of grace. His way of thinking about holiness was not abstract in any sense. He always stayed close to lived experience. He analyzed it more in the way of a psychologist than a theologian. And this is the way that the Desert Fathers also proceeded. But the theological analysis that I've just sketched out is consistent with Newman's. They illuminate each other. So it is that when Newman speaks about holiness in priests, he emphasizes that those who are most loving and wise will be those most in touch with their old Adam, with their secret faults, their weaknesses, the temptations of the flesh. And that is because theologically, all of the virtues and all of the gifts that make for holiness operate together, the lowest with the highest, fear of the Lord with wisdom. Here is how Newman puts it in the sermon which the Pope quoted at his beatification. And I quote from Newman: "Saints in plenty there have been among priests, yet out of them all high has been their sanctity, varied their graces, awful their gifts. There has not been one who did not begin with the old Adam, not one of them who was not hewn out of the same rock as the most obdurate of reprobates." Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Obdurate of reprobates. "Not one of them who is not fashioned unto honor out of the same clay which has been the material of the most polluted and vile of sinners. Not one who is not by nature brother of those poor souls who have now commenced an eternal fellowship with the devil and are burning in hell. Priests who have the charge of the faithful, whatever be their sanctity, are by nature no better than those whom they have to convert, whom they have to reform. It is God's special mercy toward you, speaking to laymen, that we by nature are no other than you. It is his consideration and compassion for you that he has made us your brethren, his legates and ministers of reconciliation. Now, how does this work? How does it work that a priest, in his own knowledge of himself and his own human weaknesses and faults, how is it that this gives him power for ministry? Exactly. Let me offer a couple of case studies briefly. Say that you're listening to a young man telling you about his temptation to suicide following a breakup with his girlfriend. He presents his temptation as despair. Now I, the priest, recall a memory of my childhood when I lashed out at my parents. I said, "You'll be sorry when I'm dead." Did you ever say that to your parents? I remember once doing it. "You'll be sorry when I'm dead." Now, I can offer this young man the insight that his temptation may not be so much a temptation to despair as a temptation to revenge. Revenge, getting back at the girlfriend. "You'll be sorry when I'm dead." And this may give him hope, because it's easier to resist a temptation to revenge than it is to resist a temptation to despair. So I think there's an example of pastoral wisdom there that comes from the knowledge of one's own self, a knowledge extending perhaps back to one's childhood. Consider another case. You're listening to a man who tells you that he's trapped in an adulterous affair that he can't get out of after a one-night stand with a woman he doesn't love. Happened because they were drunk, far from home. She threatens to tell his wife about it if he dumps her. So for years, he's been trapped in this relationship. He thinks he's a helpless victim. He's tempted to murder the woman. Now, I recall memories of my childhood, as I'm listening to this, of having locked myself into a false situation by successfully telling a lie. Right? You tell one lie, you're committed to a whole string of them. There's no end to it. In order to avoid exposure, I have to multiply my lying. Same principle as a Ponzi scheme. Now, I can offer this poor man the insight that he's being trapped not so much by the woman's threat as by his own cowardice, though understandably. He doesn't have to murder her. He only has to tell his wife the truth before she does. But this takes courage. Examples, simple examples of how you can draw upon the wisdom that comes from your own knowledge of self. These are cases in which a priest's self-knowledge gives him not just an understanding clinically, but a sympathetic understanding of the people who seek his help. Notice that they both involved secret faults that are disguised by what the person presents as the problem. He's disguising perhaps the desire for revenge by presenting his problem as despair. The other one is disguising cowardice by saying he's being tempted to murder. The real fault is disguised because it is the more humiliating. The priest can't help him if he can't see through to the truth about this person, and he can only do that if he has seen through himself. But what is it that motivates the priest to care at all about this person? What gives him zeal for the salvation of his soul? And Newman says it can only be the experience of grace in his own life. He wants the person to know the same God whom he came to know through the knowledge of himself and through the gift of grace. One of the unique contributions of Newman's thinking is his understanding of holiness through the analysis of how knowledge of self leads to the knowledge of God. For Newman, self-knowledge is by way of the experience of conscience, which he considers to be the voice of God speaking to the heart, a person's first, most fundamental encounter with the reality of God is through the experience of conscience. And this is what leads him to the knowledge of self, through the knowledge of self, to know God more deeply. As you listen to Newman's account in this sermon entitled Inward Witness to the Truth of the Gospel, I suggest that the experience of conscience that he describes psychologically can be thought of theologically as the most basic gift of the Holy Spirit, the fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord. Here's what he says. Consider that those who try to obey God gain a knowledge of themselves, and this may be shown to be the first and principal step towards knowing God. For let us suppose a child under God's blessing, profiting by his teacher's guidance, and trying to do his duty and please God, that is, to learn virtue. He will perceive that there is much in him which ought not to be in him. His own natural sense of right and wrong tells him that peevishness, sullenness, deceit, and self-will are tempers and principles of which he has cause to be ashamed. And he feels that these bad tempers and principles are in his heart. As he grows older, he will understand this more and more. Wishing then and striving to act up to the law of conscience, he will yet find that with his utmost efforts and after his most earnest prayers, he still falls short of what he knows to be right and what he aims at. Conscience, however, being respected, will become a more powerful and enlightened guide than before. It will become more refined and hard to please, and he will understand and perceive more clearly the distance that exists between his own conduct and thoughts and perfection. He will admire and take pleasure in the holy law of God, of which he reads in scriptures, but he will be humbled as understanding himself to be a continual transgressor against it. Thus he will learn from experience the doctrine of original sin before he knows the actual name of it. He will in fact say to himself what St. Paul describes all beginners in religion as saying, "What I would, that do I not, but what I hate, that do I. I delight in the law of God after the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity. I know that in my flesh dwelleth no good thing." The effect of this experience will be to make him take it for granted as an elementary truth that he cannot gain heaven for himself, to make him feel himself guilty before God, and to feel moreover that he, even were he admitted into the divine presence, yet till his heart be, so to say, made over again, he cannot perfectly enjoy God. This surely is the state of self-knowledge. These are the convictions to which everyone is brought on who attempts honestly to obey God. I do not mean that all that I have sinned will necessarily pass through his mind and in the same order, or that he will be conscious of it or be able to speak of it, but that on the whole, thus he will feel. So conscience introduces the child to the existence of one who is lawgiver and judge, one infinitely greater than himself, though experienced within himself. The fear of the Lord impels him to the effort to obey his conscience, making it ever more refined and hard to please. At the same time, fear of the Lord brings him to the knowledge that he cannot gain heaven for himself, opens him to the necessity of being made over again, created anew. Nothing less will suffice. So he's open to the gospel that God is offering him no less than that, to be made over again. The lawgiver and judge is also the Savior, who has mercy. His experience of conscience leads to the inward witness to the truth of the gospel, makes him reach out for it, grasp it when it's offered. And unless we who are entrusted with the preaching of the gospel, including our sacramental ministry, possess this inward witness in ourselves, our preaching is going to be sterile. We will not be preaching the gospel of salvation for the love of God and love of souls, but subtly for the love of self. Let me conclude by giving two examples of clergy I have known who have been brought to experience an inward witness to the truth of the gospel through a knowledge of their own hearts, and who through the gift of the fear of the Lord have been brought to spiritual wisdom, and whose ministry has been transformed by this into something powerful and effective. The examples I'm going to give are real examples, happened to friends of mine. They're Anglican clergy, friends from long ago, so it's unlikely they'll be listening to this. If they do, I'll have a lot to answer for. Names have been changed to protect the guilty. One person I will call the good guy, and the other I will call the teacher's pet. First, the good guy. Let's call him Paul. He was the son of a clergyman, and he was following his father's path to ministry. He had confidence that he knew what it was all about, having been brought up in a rectory. He was a gregarious, friendly fellow, full of good cheer. Everyone considered him a good guy and liked being in his company. Now we, friends of his, were aware of certain minor faults. He was casual about being on time. He was forgetful. He was easily distracted. He was really too laid back. In fact, you'd have to say he was a little lazy. We all knew this about him, and we all forgave him for it because it was all eclipsed by his charm. He was such a good guy. Now, Paul married a woman, let's call her Margie, who was his opposite in these respects, and perfect complement. Margie organized him, kept his schedule, reminded him of things. She could be a bit of a pain, but we all agreed that our good guy friend needed someone like her to keep him in line. Now, Paul received his first pastoral assignment in a small town in Vermont. When they got there, he and Margie were well received. As usual, everybody liked him. After he had been there a few months, it happened that the most respected and beloved member of his parish died. Paul made the arrangements for the funeral, and then he recorded the date for the funeral on the wrong day in his calendar, which was a typical mistake. On the day of the funeral, which the whole parish was expected to attend, Paul took the day off and went skiing. Every priest's nightmare. When he came home in the evening, his wife met him at the rectory door. She'd been out working all day, and she didn't realize that her husband had gone skiing. She told him that the local congregational minister had to be called in at the last minute to take the funeral. She told him he better go over to the widow's house right away and face the music. Of course, he was stunned. He quickly changed into his clericals, and he rushed over to the dead man's house. His family and friends were all gathered there for supper. Paul knocked at the door, shaking in his boots. The widow answered. She saw who it was. She came out, and she threw her arms around him, saying, "You poor man, you must feel so bad. Come in and have supper." Paul told me later that the widow's charity was the greatest moment of grace he had ever experienced in his life. At the same time, it was the most severe revelation of his own faults that he'd ever suffered. The two went together. He said that he stood naked at that door, and the widow clothed him with her love. He stood naked at that door, and the widow clothed him with her love. The good guy was humbled, and at that moment, there was created in his soul an inward witness to the truth of the gospel that informed all of his subsequent ministry. And he never did anything like that again. So that's the first true story. The second, I'm going to call the teacher's pet. And I really hope that the person this is about doesn't hear this. All through school, let's call him Jason, was the teacher's pet. He was smart, good-looking, and hardworking. He didn't consciously seek to be the teacher's pet, but he was always favored anyway. He accepted the role even though he was aware that his classmates didn't like him for it. He didn't know what else he could do because he wanted to succeed in school. Jason had a vocation to the ministry, and he was attracted to the life and work of the small religious order that ran his high school. He joined the community, and then he found that his novice master was someone who had been one of his teachers, one who had favored him. The pattern continued through his formation. Eventually, the novice master became his superior and made Jason his vicar and secretary. Jason continued his pattern of high performance, and again he was aware that this inspired some resentment in his peers. He was also aware that his superior was becoming emotionally dependent on him. He wanted Jason to be with him constantly. He confided in Jason. He leaned on him. Again, Jason went along with it, thinking it was his duty, and secretly expecting that he would eventually someday be superior himself. He was ambitious, but he disguised his ambition, even from himself, by believing it was just doing his duty. Jason was becoming increasingly aware that his superior was a weak man and that he was propping him up. And this bothered him, but again he thought it was his duty. One day the superior asked Jason to be his hatchet man, to expel a couple of brothers who were suspected of having a love affair. In fact, Jason disagreed with this decision. He disagreed with this perception about the two brothers, but he went ahead and did what he was told and went out and expelled them. But his conscience bothered him. He tried to suppress it, but he couldn't. He eventually decided to confront his superior and tell him that he thought that the decision had been wrong, and to tell him that he resented the fact that he had been made to act as the hatchet man. He was deciding to tell the truth for the first time. He asked the superior to rethink the decision, and he offered to discuss ways to repair it. The two brothers had gone to live with a family who sympathized with them, but the superior refused to consider it, and he accused Jason of being disobedient. Whereupon, at this meeting, Jason shocked himself by having a meltdown. He exploded with rage. He stood up and he took a chair and he threw it across the room at the superior. And then he stomped out of the office, slamming the door. He'd never done anything remotely like this before. And as he cooled down, he began to realize that this incident was the release of a lot of pent-up anger that he'd been harboring for years. And he never felt better in his life. He told me that. I've never felt better in my life. Now later in the same day, the superior called Jason back to meet with him and another brother who had been his classmate, and he thought a friend. It turned out that this other brother had advised the superior to remove Jason from his position immediately and to require him to see a psychiatrist. Jason went to the psychiatrist, and in the middle of his account of what had happened, he discovered that the psychiatrist was falling asleep. And so Jason told me that when the psychiatrist sort of finally came to, he asked the psychiatrist, "Am I boring you?" And the psychiatrist said, "Yes, you are." Jason said, "Why?" He said, "I would have done exactly what you did." So with a new clarity, Jason realized that this brother who was meeting with him with the superior had been his secret rival all along and had now replaced him in their superior's favor. In fact, a lot was now clear to him, including his own secret ambition, disguised under the appearance of duty. He realized that this incident in the superior's office had been a breakthrough, a moment of grace that released him from his lifelong role of teacher's pet. He gladly accepted his new role of bad boy in his community. And he moved happily into an obscure and humble position in parish ministry, far from the mother house, with no more part to play in the community's governance, and enjoying for the first time the real affection of his peers. In the end, he was even reconciled with his superior and with the brother who had succeeded him. Now, Jason says now that as a result of this stormy breakthrough, he got to see the truth about himself for the first time, and for the first time was able to separate his call to ministry from his ambition to succeed. He says that he can preach the gospel to his parishioners with a new kind of clarity as a result. Now he has an inward witness to the truth of the Lord's rebuke to his disciples when they were arguing among themselves about who among them would be greatest. So in the end, I'd like to recommend to us all to try to, in some quiet time, recall a moment of grace in your life as a priest. A moment of grace in which you experienced an inward witness to the truth of what we preach and what we do in our sacramental ministry.